I'm here with my colleague, fellow friend of Gibraltar, Rupert Haig-Holmes. Together, we're going to give you a little bit of a quick tour around various aspects of Gibraltar, which hopefully will highlight a lot of the areas that we do kind of overlap with Gosport, but obviously things that are very unique to Gibraltar. And for those of you that may not be familiar, I'll start off first with a little short introduction on Gibraltar and its history. And then after about 10-15 minutes, I'll then pass over to Rupert, who's a very well-respected historian and author on all things to do with military history, but I'll let Rupert say more about that, about his background. So let me just start off with myself. My father was in the RAF, stationed in Gibraltar back in the 50s. Across the border is a little town there from Spain, where he met my mum. They married. I was born in Gibraltar. We lived there on and off for the next 10-15 years, and then we moved back to the UK in '69 when the border with Gibraltar and between Gibraltar and Spain was shut. And I've lived here as an adult most of my life. I am actually now finally moving back to Gib in a couple of months' time. I've been trying to do that all my life. I'm pretty typical of the Gibraltarian kind of story and experience. It's mixed families, mixed backgrounds, mixed cultures. And as you'll see from my presentation, it's quite a hotbed of different inputs. So I'll do a little bit of general, then pass over to Rupert, who'll be a little bit more specific on the military background and connection. I'm just going to go over to my sharing screen, and hopefully, as we've just proved, it's working now.
This is interesting.
Yeah.
Rita, could I just ask whether you would mute your microphone?
Yeah, sure.
Just while the talk is on, and then we can go for questions later. Thank you so much.
Can you hear now? No.
Yes.
You can still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, well, I've put it on mute.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. Can you see the logo of the Friends of Gibraltar okay?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Well, just a very, very little bit about ourselves. We're a charitable society. We're based in the UK. We have around 500 members. We've been going since the 1980s. We have two prime roles. One is to raise funds, and by channeling it mainly through the Gibraltar Heritage Trust, to support heritage projects in Gibraltar. So that's one of our two big goals, to preserve the heritage of Gibraltar for the future, really, and for future generations, which nowadays is becoming quite a challenge with financial pressures. The second part is to get the story of Gibraltar and its heritage over into the UK, but also around the world. And my role with the Friends has marketing and marketing and engagement director. It's quite useful to start off doing an introduction on Gibraltar, just to remind ourselves, and even for those that know, but for those that don't know, where Gibraltar is in the Mediterranean, and how much of an impact the whole Mediterranean history over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years has had an impact on Gibraltar. Now, I don't know, can you actually see my mouse on the screen? You can, okay. Well, for those of you that aren't certain, Gibraltar is that ever so slightly small little speck there. And yet over the last 2,000 years, as you can see, it's the main entrance in and out of the Mediterranean. And over the last 2,000 years, a lot has happened in the Mediterranean. So, and we've been at this end of it, and virtually anything that does go on passes through Gibraltar. So we've had the Phoenicians go past, we've had the Romans in their times go past, we've had the Greeks, we've had, of course, North African, the Arabs, We even, back in the 800s, we even had Vikings coming through Gibraltar, and they've all left their mark and their impact, and it's part and parcel of what makes Gibraltar quite unique. So it's important to understand that. So we've got in Gibraltar, which you'll see in a minute, is only 2.5 square miles, but we have a community of Jewish people who have come from different parts of the Mediterranean over many, many years. We have an Indian community that's come over from India, way down there, mainly because of the trading routes with the British Empire. We have obviously a strong connection with Spanish, and we have lots of mixed marriages. We have a community from Genoa here in Italy, fishermen initially, who settled down on one of the coastal sides of Gibraltar. We have a lot of Arabs in Gibraltar, and of course we've got a lot of Anglo expats, either from the military or from civilian working, or some that just landed there on a holiday and never left. So it's an incredible mix, and for a small place it packs quite a punch, because it has got virtually everything that you would assume a country has, and certainly more than a major town or city would have. So that's its relationship to the whole Mediterranean. If I just home in a little bit more closely, again, still that little speck there is Gibraltar. There's a small little narrow bit of land there that connects us to Spain, so it is technically a peninsula. About 10 miles across the straits is Ceuta, North Africa, and of course you've got Tangiers here. And you've got, I think it's around a quarter or a third of the world's merchant shipping goes through the straits, and all you've got to do, I play squash, I go over there quite regularly, and right on the southernmost tip is the squash club, and it's got a great viewing gallery of these straits. And after a game, as I'm sitting down there drinking a pint of orange juice and lemonade, I can look across the air, and it just doesn't stop, the merchant shipping. Of course, quite a lot of it will stop at Gibraltar for repairs, maintenance, and for refueling and changing of crew. So it's extremely busy and extremely active. And of course, the Royal Navy, a very, very regular visitor over there. This is what it was like around 100 years ago. As you can see, not much going on. They used to have horse racing and fox hunting on that strip. Now, that same strip, which is this bit here, is totally built up. We have an airport runway here. We have our own port here, and we have military bases for the army as well. So even though now it's obviously mainly a kind of civilian population, there is still a very, very strong military background. But it's changed a tremendous amount. That's the view from the east side. And as you can see, most of the built-up is just in this kind of small area down here. But as land being so small, the population of now nearly 40,000 continually growing, the pressure on land and the pressure on heritage land and sites is quite intense. And the view now is that, which is extremely different. All of this was underwater when I lived there in the 60s. This detached mole was here, or the South Mole. There was a detached mole here, and the ferries from across in Spain used to come into here, and from Tangiers they come into here. But this was all water, and I used to go swimming there as a 13-year-old somewhere in there. So it's changed tremendously, and it's still changing. There's another big marina in the next 3 or 5 years, which is going to be growing up here. There's another one on the other side. Phenomenal rate of growth, and fascinating place as well. So let's start off with a brief run through the history. The first thing to mention, the first time Gibraltar really lands on the map is around 50,000 years ago, when the last remaining Neanderthals from Europe, the remains were found in these caves just on one side of the rock. It's now a national heritage site, and I went down there last year, and it's incredible to go there and still see some of their carvings on the walls. And of course, 50,000 years ago, this was not sea. It would come out a few hundred yards and there'd be wildlife, and that's where they would come. So that's the first time that Gibraltar kind of hits the world map. Not much happened in Gibraltar up till then. It was kind of ignored for a while. But then in 711, just across the border, the Moors sort of looked over and thought, well, that would be a nice place to take over. So they just nipped across the states and took over Gibraltar, and were there for the next 700 years, and started to build around Gibraltar. And that castle, the remains of the castle you see on the left, is called the Moorish Castle. And they were there till 1462, when Spain recaptured Gibraltar and absorbed it, obviously, into the mainland. This was at the height of the Spanish Empire, and they pushed the barbarians back, took over Gibraltar, and started to put their mark. And they were there till 1704, when the British with the Dutch captured Gibraltar off the Spanish, and then went about building all the fortifications to keep it as a British colony in those days. And of course, Britain was looking to expand like mad. It already had the early stages of its empire. So an outpost in such a strategic location as Gibraltar was seen as very, very valuable. So they did everything to keep it. And at the same time, Spain did everything to try and take it back. So for the next 100 years, there were, I think, in total 14 different sieges of Gibraltar, one lasting 3 years, to try and get it back. Fortunately, they didn't in the end. They gave up the military side, but there is still an ongoing dispute on who actually owns, with Spain claiming it's still theirs. In 1713, a treaty was signed, Treaty of Utrecht, which gave the sovereignty of Gibraltar from Spain to the UK, and it's been there since. Another key thing, that just a very quick one, that was one of the sieges. It was hell at the time, and there are still the scars in Gibraltar buildings that shows the effects of it. You can probably see here, all this was flat, marshy land, and the Spanish soldiers would continually try and come here. Gibraltar fortified all of this and were able to parry them off quite easily, because, to be quite honest, they were just sitting ducks there. So after 14 attempts, they gave up. That's a scene of the Battle of Trafalgar, which, of course, was significant, not only obviously because it beat the French and the Spanish, but it also tipped things over towards Great Britain and helped to consolidate and strengthen the growth of the empire. Of course, Gibraltar went through being a British colony. Obviously, during the First and the Second World War, it was impacted, and particularly in the Second World War. And this is one thing that, for me, when I was talking to Terry about coming up with a theme for this, we struck with a connection, and there are obvious military connections, and Rupert will cover a few of them. But for me, it's actually the personal story and the lives of the people that, to me, is a big connection, because just as in Gosport, which has a very strong military, naval, obviously, base and role for hundreds of years now, Gibraltar equally, and to such an extent that during the war, the Second World War, all the civilians, the women, the children, men above and under a certain age, were evacuated from Gibraltar in 1940 and taken to, some went to London, some went to Ireland, some went to Malta, some went to the Madeira Islands, the Portuguese islands, and some of them didn't come back until 1948-50. And that there are still people obviously alive who talk about it and the incredible impact it had. And of course, people in Gosport would have suffered tremendously as well. And I think it's easy to kind of overlook the impact of living in such a important strategic military base with a naval connection and how that's affected people's lives. I've got these out of order a little bit, so excuse me while I just want to go to this one. The other big thing is before the Suez Canal, and this is obviously the growth of the British Empire, which, as you know, was worldwide, and all the shipping, all the trade, and all the military side would come through the Navy. So before the Suez Canal, most of it went this way. There was always some traffic coming into Gibraltar and into here in North Africa, but mainly it went this route. After the Suez Canal was opened, which made obviously trade with India, with Australia, and opened up the Middle East, that's when things really took off. And Gibraltar became a very, very important base. Malta followed, Cyprus followed. And in those days, because of sail power, it was important to have bases every 1,000 miles or so that the ships could pick up fresh water, fresh food, give people a rest, etc. So Gibraltar was very, very important as a first base. Gibraltar, then to Malta, then to Cyprus, then across here, you had the Middle East, and then from there it could go to India and then work all its way over to Australia. So it played a fundamental role, not just obviously in the world wars, but in the growth of the empire and the growth of the Commonwealth, and still plays a significant role. One of the areas is the trade side. Oh, sorry, going back. Let me just go back to his. Yeah, I've got them out of order for something. Sorry, going back to the personal connection, we just had this afternoon, Terry sent me this email through from Ian Jeffrey, who I believe is a well-known local historian in Gosport. And Terry will correct me soon if I'm wrong here. But he sends this little personal kind of family story where his great-grandparents were in Gibraltar for most of his military career. And then when he finished, he was a Royal Marine. When he finished, he then moved to Gosport. He's got some notes here. Originally from Wales, joined the Marines, based at the Fortin Barracks, now called St. Vincent, married there, had 8 children. And apparently when they moved back on retirement to Gosport, they moved into the very first council house, which apparently was in 1 San Diego Road. I don't know it personally myself, but maybe some of you will. And one of the children there died in a bombing raid over the Netherlands. And the daughter, who comes from Gibraltar, then married a Gosport, William. And I think such a simple story, and these are the 2 children of the so they would be grandchildren generation. Even though in the grand scheme of things, it may not seem very important or significant, but I think it's very, very important to remember that historical events and big events touch everybody's lives, and we all get influenced by it. And whether we're in Gosport or whether we're in Gibraltar, we all share that connection. Okay, I think I'm coming close to the end of my time. That's about the evacuation. Yeah, these things did get out of order. I'm sorry about that. Gibraltar today is a very, very thriving city. It's got a very strong Indian, Moroccan, Pakistani, Jewish, Italian, English, Spanish, community. I'm sure I've missed somebody out there. It's even now got a growing Ukrainian community, because a lot of the refugees, quite a few were taken in by Gibraltar, and there's now quite a strong Ukrainian community in Gibraltar. You can walk up and down Main Street, which is the picture on the bottom left, and you can hear Hindi being spoken, Jewish being spoken, Arabic being spoken, English, of course, and often strange dialects and strange kind of languages being developed when people start mixing the words. And Gibraltar's got beaches, it's got a national football team, it's got everything you could expect, even British pubs. And that beach there is my favorite, and it's I'm sure it's tainted by the fact that when I was 13, 14, I was the chain boy on this project, and my dad was the architect, and we were there when none of this was there. So it's great to go back and see something that I personally had a hand in putting together. You can't do a presentation on Gibraltar without including the apes. So I threw one in there before looking carefully at it, and then suddenly realized, well, I'm not quite certain what he's doing, but he seems to be entertaining the tourists there. And they are full of character, these apes, and they often come down into the town centre and raid. And if you keep your windows open, they'll come into your room, open the fridge, and take the food out from there as well. But anyway, I hope that's given you a little snapshot on Gibraltar and has set the scene for Rupert, which we've got a question and answer session at the end of this. So if you've got questions, then save them from then, and we'll be very happy to have a chat and answer them then. So Rupert, over to you.
Thank you, Len. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. It's completely my fault that we were late starting, because I'm here based in Jersey, and for whatever reason, we got some connectivity issues in Jersey this evening. So I hope you can hear me. We've had to do a workaround where Len is going to show my slides because I wasn't able to get them up on my screen. So firstly, a little bit about me. Len is being incredibly generous. I'm not an accomplished military historian at all. I'm a budding military historian. My connections with Gibraltar are family. So my parents, I come from a military background, and my mother grew up in Gibraltar. My grandfather was a sapper, and my parents, and subsequently my father's in the army, and they did 2 tours actually in Gibraltar. So before I get into the links with Gosport, I just wanted to set a bit of strategic stuff for you from a military perspective. Len really has sort of set the macro sense, but why is Gibraltar so important to Britain from a military perspective? Because it's actually an incredibly small place, as Len said. It's only 2.6 square miles. It's only got 40,000 residents. It's only got about 1,300 British troops on it, whereas 30, 40 years ago, it might have had probably 4 times that. And it's got 300 apes. So why is it important to Britain? Well, I think there's 3 key things here, really. One is, and Len did touch on this, its location and topography. It's at the mouth of the Mediterranean, which means that strategically, the British can keep an eye on what is coming in and what is going out of the Mediterranean, both commercial and military. But the second thing to bear in mind is it's a great pivot, Gibraltar. So it's a great place to be able to deploy people quickly. It's got an airfield and it's got a port. So you can deploy people quickly into the Mediterranean if we need to. Cyprus is useful, but particularly for the Middle East, more down the Middle East. So we've got both the western side of the Mediterranean and the eastern side covered off. So Gibraltar's got a real value there. The ability to be able to put people quickly into that part of the Mediterranean if we need to. And then lastly, and I think this is probably the most important, it's got a highly valuable intelligence gathering facility on the top of the rock. So at Windmill Hill, and if any of you are ex-military, you'll know this, there is a Royal Navy listening post up there. There's also a security service input in there as well. And also, you may not know this, the US Navy, by agreement with the Royal Navy, have also got a capability up there as well. The rock is very, very high. It's higher than the Empire State Building, actually. So it really does enable us, in a military sense, with the Americans, to be able to eavesdrop on traffic in the Western Mediterranean. There's a real value to that. The other thing, I think, before I get into the connections with Gosport, the other thing is the political will of the Gibraltarians. So Len's probably being a bit shy on this because he's Gibraltarian, but there's a huge amount of loyalty in Gibraltar towards the UK, and I'll talk a little bit about the history and the Treaty of Utrecht and the political wrangling that's gone on there. But the reality is that Gibraltar wants to be part of the UK. So the last referendum was in 2002, and that returned an overwhelming, I think it was 98% of Gibraltarians wanted to continue to be attached to the United Kingdom. So Gibraltar is a British overseas territory, and therefore it's got a military and foreign office attachment to the UK. And the Gibraltarians want that, and they will. I think it's going to take a very seismic event in the Mediterranean for that to change. So that's the kind of background. So what I'm going to do this evening, I'm conscious of time, and we were late starting, so I'm going to talk probably for about 30 minutes now. And I've got 4 or 5 areas really I want to touch on. So Len, I don't know whether you're able to bring up the slides, but if not, I'll just keep talking anyway. So I'm going to cover 5 things really where there are connections between Gosport and Gibraltar. And I suppose probably some of these are obvious, so to bear with me, and particularly if you're of the military, if you're a veteran, you'll probably know some of this stuff, so just bear with me. But hopefully for others, there'll be some nuggets of information that you haven't heard before. So the first thing is the hospitals. So I suspect some of the people listening in here are from the Gosport area, and I'm not going to talk at length about Haslar and what a fantastic capability that is. But there's a real link between the hospital in Gibraltar and Haslar, which came through the Battle of Trafalgar. I'm going to talk about victualling and ammunition and Priddy's Heart. I'm going to talk about brickworks and blockhouses. There's a Royal Marines connection as well, and actually Ian Jeffrey's already touched slightly on that with the thing that he sent in this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about submarines, and again, obviously, those who are from the Gosport area know all about HMS Dolphin and the submarine capability that was there. But just moving on to the hospital slide, please, Len. So actually, the first naval hospital was not in the UK, and it wasn't in Gibraltar, and it wasn't at Haslar, actually. It was in Minorca, which was built in 1711. But Gibraltar and Haslar were not far behind in getting hospitals of their own. Gibraltar's first hospital was built in 1741, interestingly using a lot of craftsmen from the Portsmouth and Gosport areas who went down there to build it. It was built on a plateau, a little way inland from Rosier Bay, a little bit further down from the dockyard as you go south towards the tip of Gibraltar, which is Europa Point. The site was chosen there for a very similar reason to the reason that Haslar was located where it was, which is it was designed to stop deserters, pressed men, from absconding as casualties, and also particularly in a Gibraltar context, to stop them from getting into the town and causing mischief there. So the first hospital in Gibraltar. So Len, I don't know if you want to move on to the next slide, please.
Hold on.
Yeah. So the first hospital in Gibraltar was quite large actually. It took about 100 men, which was about twice the size of the Minorca, the first hospital, and it was built as a 2-story quadrangle. It's not actually the one you see in the photo. I'll come to that in a second. But the key development for the first naval hospital in Gibraltar was this concept of having verandas, open verandas, which the climate allowed, which stopped the scourge of many naval hospitals at that time, which was the spread of infection. So they were able to build the first hospital in Gibraltar with nice open verandas, which enabled to mitigate against the risk of infection. But the first hospital was, and I'll come back to the Trafalgar link a little bit later. But the first hospital was superseded by the one you see on the top photograph, which is shaded in this sort of light blue top, so bottom left of the top photograph there. And that was the hospital that was built in 1901. And if any of you have served there, it only closed in 1993. You'll probably remember it as the Wedgwood Castle, which was its nickname because of the blue colouring. Its first influx of patients was during the Spanish Civil War in the mid-1930s, where the hospital catered for casualties from all sides, interestingly including 55 German sailors from the battleship Deutschland, which had been hit by bombs whilst lying off the coast of Ibiza. And the interesting part of this was the Queen's Alexander Royal Army Nursing Corps nurses that were sent down from the UK to assist. Their work was so valued that Adolf Hitler, in fact, awarded the most senior lady with a German Red Cross medal, which he presented personally to her in Berlin in 1938. So during the Second World War, this hospital, you see, played an important part in looking after the casualties from the convoys to and from Malta. And as the threat of invasion during the Second World War increased, they built another hospital in the tunnels. So one of the things Len didn't mention about Gibraltar is the rock is of limestone, which means it's very pliable, it's very strong, very strong load bearing, but it also means it's quite easy to cut into it. And that was the background to the tunnels being built, originally for the siege, and then very much so in the Second World War. Just one last comment on the Gibraltar hospitals. And it ties it back to what Len was saying earlier about the apes. So you may know this if you're ex-military, but the apes were always under control of the British military until about 20 years ago, I think, where they were handed over to the government. This isn't necessarily known quite that well known, but actually there was an officer who was given a role. It was a paid service sinecure to look after the apes on the rock. And their births were gazetted in military fashion, and every new ape that was born was given a name, usually after a governor or a high-ranking officer. But the time with the hospital is that if they ever got injured, which they did, sometimes they're hit by traffic and things, they were always treated in this role in the naval hospital that you see, as if they were a serving seaman or a serving soldier. So just quickly touching on Haslar, there are some similarities here. The location of where Haslar was built started in 1745 when the land was bought. It took a few years to build Haslar. Reason being is that many of the builders got pressed into the Navy. So every time they managed to get a bit of it built, they'd then press gang would come around and collect them up and take them off. So they had to get some more builders. That's why it took between 1745 to 1762 to build it. Originally, the idea was to build a quadrangle, four legs to it, or three limbs. Only three were actually built. I think they ran out of money. But the similarity was that Haslar was put where it was to, it was surrounded by the estuary and the estuary mud. The idea being is that people shouldn't be able to abscond too easily from it. And certainly the early years of Haslar, there were a lot of problems. Drunkenness, theft, both amongst the staff and patients. So in the late 18th century, the Admiralty made quite a lot of changes in the hospital, which really did improve the lot of the sailor being treated there. Another feature that's similar between the two hospitals is that, and again, if you're from the Gosport area, you'll probably know this, but the Royal Navy started admitting Royal Air Force and Army patients in there, and a similar thing was done in Gibraltar as well. And then ultimately, 1966, Haslar did become a tri-service hospital. So I just want to cover off actually the main link, which is Trafalgar, between the two hospitals. Obviously, in the Gibraltar context, this is the first hospital, not the one you see on the slide. And that really comes back to the treatment of the casualties after the Battle of Trafalgar. So I'm not going to go through the Battle of Trafalgar, that's a completely different subject in itself, but you will know it was a resounding victory for the Royal Navy. They didn't lose a single ship, but they did have about 1,500 casualties. The Spanish, on the other hand, lost about 19 ships, and no one really knows quite how many French and Spanish sailors were killed. Probably the figures are somewhere between 13,000 and 16,000. Cape Trafalgar is about 83 nautical miles southwest of Gibraltar, but it took the ships about a week to get to Gibraltar because there was a huge storm after the battle, which raged for about 4 days. But eventually the casualties started arriving. A gentleman called Eric Burbeck of the Haslar Heritage Group done some really good research. He spent a lot of time in Kew in the National Archives looking at the data relating to casualties coming in from Trafalgar. And what he's come up with is the first battle casualties were received into the old Naval Hospital in Gibraltar, were 57 casualties. They arrived on the 27th of October, 1805. So that's about 10 days after the battle. From the ship Belle Isle. Interestingly, many of them were returned back to the ship after having been treated within about 10 days. And then subsequently more casualties arrived. So we get 48 from Her Majesty's ship Colossus on the 28th of October, another 10 from Revenge, another 51 from Bellerophon. And of this lot, only about 12 die. The rest are all treated in Gibraltar and put back on their ships in the custody of the surgeons to go back to England. And then lastly, on the 29th of October, that's 11 days after the battle, HMS Victory arrives and hands over her casualties, which are 26 of them. And many of you, I haven't got a picture of it, many of you will have seen the picture of HMS Victory coming into Gibraltar. Her masts all broken. And of course, also she had on board the body of Lord Nelson, who'd been killed in the battle. So during the course of October 1805, there's 294 admissions into the Royal Naval Hospital in Gibraltar. And as I said, many of them treated and put back into the care of the surgeons of their ships for transporting back to England. Only about 90 die in Gibraltar, and only 2, if you've been to Gibraltar and you've been to the Trafalgar Cemetery, you'll see that there's actually only 2 graves for Trafalgar casualties. I'm sorry, I can't remember the names. And the reason for that, where the other 88, well, the reason for that is the original burial site's just been lost in the fullness of time. No one's quite sure. I'm sure there's a job for an archaeologist out there, actually. No one's quite sure where the other 88 Trafalgar casualties are on Gibraltar. The key point here is that the ships then sailed back to England, and ships Mars, Africa, Colossus, and Temeraire, they all arrive at Haslar on the 1st of December 1805 to discharge many of the sailors who've been injured. Victory herself arrives on the 5th of December. She doesn't go into Portsmouth. She just anchors off Spithead and discharges the dying and wounded to Haslar before she sails on to Chatham. And of course, many of those who died in Haslar from their wounds, ultimately from Trafalgar, are buried with no headstones in the paddock at Haslar. So there you can see, a good example, I think, of how those hospitals played an important part. So I'm going to move on to victualling and ammunition. So Len, if you wouldn't mind moving on. So I'm going to just talk briefly about Pretty's Hard, obviously. Those from Gosport will know it. A big ammunition manufacturing centre for the Royal Navy. And Great Clarence Yard, you can see the entrance to it there on the top of the slide. And also I'm going to talk about the victualling yard. You can just see the headstone to the victualling yard in Gibraltar. Just starting with Pretty's Hard. So Pretty's Hard was acquired by the Crown and the Ordnance Board in 1750. And by 1757, the whole of the area around Pretty's Hard, Forton, that area, completely sealed off to the public. And amazingly, that remained the case for nearly over 200 years. And everyone who lived in the Forton Lake area and Forton knew that they could not get into to Pretty's Hard. There was lots of speculation as to what went on there. Always an element of mystique. Always people coming in and out the main gate, and no one seemed to sort of admit that they actually worked there. And possibly many of the residents in that area didn't realise that they were actually living next door to a facility that was building a huge amount of ammunition for and making weapons for the fleet. In Nelson's days, Victory and the other vessels were supplied from Pretty's Hard. The Grand Magazine there held no less than 4,500 barrels of gunpowder. They each weighed about 45 kilograms. And Pretty's Hard was built using over 3 million bricks with very, very thick brick walls for obvious reasons. And with easy access to the dockyard across the water, the Hard was an ideal location for the magazine. You will know that Pretty's Hard no longer is an armaments capability for the Navy. That all got moved in about the late 1980s. The reason being is that the buildings there just couldn't keep up with the technology of weaponry and what was needed for the fleet. So Royal Clarence Yard, again, those of you from the Gosport area will know it well. Probably along with the Royal William Yard in Plymouth, the two main victualling facilities in England, named after the Duke of Clarence, later became William IV, and developed on about 20 hectares of land, so a huge site there. Between it being set up in 1828 and then being decommissioned and Barclays Homes buying it in 1990, the yard supplied provisions to the Royal Navy for pretty well every single conflict in the period, and it stored pretty well most of the fleet's food and other provisions. Feeding the Royal Navy has always been a big job. Huge amount of quantities of ale, and up till 1971, rum, meat, bread being produced in the yard. For example, the bakery, which I believe is currently now a restaurant, the Bakehouse, or the old Bakehouse, I think it is. That's got 9, if you've been in there, perhaps many of you have, got 9 brick-lined ovens, which were able to bake 10,000 hexagonal ship's biscuits or hardtack. There's also a big cooperage cooperage being a facility that makes barrels. Before the processing of food through canning was established, everything was put in barrels to keep it fresh. And that was the mode of preservation that was used. So during the yard did take during the Second World War was quite badly damaged by the Luftwaffe actually, but still managed to continue providing provisions for the fleet. And of course, those of you who are involved at all will know both Pretty's Yard and the yard were key logistics pivots for the Falklands conflict. And now, of course, it's a mixed residential commercial use site bought by I think the Barclay Group bought it. So moving on to the victualling yard at Gibraltar. Now you can just see the headstone. It's current. I think, Len, correct me if I'm wrong here. I think it's a animal aid centre now, the victualling yard in Gibraltar. But anyway,
I'm not certain. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's always a vets or something. So the origins of that go back to about the 1700s. The victualling originally was done down in the moles that Len showed you on the slides. But the unfortunate thing was that during the Great Siege, those were capable of bombardment from the north, from the Spanish mainland. So they moved all the victualling to where you see the headstone there, which is very close to where the old hospital was on Rosier Bay, on the headland overlooking Rosier Bay. It was built by an Italian called Giovanni Maria Boschetti, and it was finished in 1812. The important bit about the victualling yard at Gibraltar is the water capability. So there were also 6 water tanks built by Boschetti at Rosier. And the way that worked is the victualling yard, the roof was slanted in such a way to collect rainwater, which was then funneled down into these tanks, purified, and then the bottom tank, so they were in a row, the bottom tank would then feed out that water to either by pipe or through lighter out to ships that came into Rosier Bay. Just touching on the victualling yard headstone there, I mentioned the name of the Italian who built it, Mr. Giovanni Maria Boschetti. You can see on the headstone there the lettering G3, DGM, B, and HR, which stands for George III, Deo Gratia, Majesta, Britannica, and Hibernia Rex. But actually, a lot of Gibraltarians think that actually what Mr. Boschetti did is he made sure that his initials GMB, which you can just see on both sides of the middle stone there, were in the headstone, so that they would be preserved for perpetuity. So the Rosier water tanks, just want to touch slightly on those, I'm conscious of time. They were an incredible facility. There were 6 tanks. The limestone of the natural limestone of Gibraltar provided a very nice film to make them secure and watertight. Grain was collected off the roof of the victualling yard and then funneled through into the tanks and purified. But they could hold 5,000 tons of water, so a really important ability to be able to provide water to ships of the Royal Navy, which Nelson, and Vincent, and many other of the admirals used to enable them to. They didn't have to go back to England to get provisioning; they could get it in Gibraltar. So very, very important there. The Rosier tanks were the subject of a massive political rankle in the mid 200s when as the military started pulling back out of Gibraltar, it started handing back all its facilities back to the government, and the government in Gibraltar decided to build a block of flats over the Rosier tanks, in fact, take them out. And there was a bit of an outcry about that, and unfortunately, the government did get its way. And there are, in fact, the Rosier tanks have gone now. There's a block of 200 flats there, which is a shame because it was a very unique piece of engineering there. So moving on, brickworks and block houses. So many of you may not know this, the Stakes Bay Brickwork down on the south there of the Gosport Peninsula. The bricks there were used to actually build a lot of fortifications that the British used in Gibraltar, put on ships and transported down to Gibraltar. And then HMS Dolphin, the blockhouse, you can see there on the top. One of the engineers there, Talbot Edwards, he built the blockhouse at HMS Dolphin in the mid 18th century, and he then moved down to Gibraltar in the run-up to the Great Siege, and was very instrumental in building some of the walls that you still see in Gibraltar if you go down there, that were used to defend the peninsula during the Great Siege. Just want to talk a little bit, and that's what the drawing at the bottom there is. Some of the walls that Talbot Edwards was involved in. Len touched on this. So that we've got this continuing political spat over Gibraltar, which all goes back to the Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, which was supposed to provide perpetual sovereignty to Britain over Gibraltar. But Spain has consistently denied that is the case. We saw this, we see this regularly. We see the incursions, the pretty regular incursions where Spanish shipping does go over the territorial waters, and the problems that creates. So just touching a little bit on the Great Siege itself, that took place between 1779 and 83, 4 years of a siege. Really, it happened because the British were distracted by what was going on in America at the time. We had the American War of Independence going on, which took a lot of energy and a lot of focus away from Gibraltar. The Spanish decided to take that opportunity to assert her desire to take Gibraltar more forcibly, which led to the siege. And the Spanish plan was really to bombard and starve the British garrison there into submission. But the garrison held out for 4 long years, and it was 4 long years, mainly due to 2 things, really. The ingenuity and resourcefulness of the then governor, who was General Sir George Eliot, who came up with some quite innovative ways of mitigating the Spanish onslaught. One of them was he ordered all the pavements in Main Street to be lifted so that when the Spanish shells started flying in from the north, they wouldn't explode because they just landed in mud. That was one little thing he came up with. The other important thing that I think led to the siege being going the way it did was the relief ships from England that came down regularly. One of the interesting things about the Great Siege is the Spanish did observe their usual siesta throughout the siege, every day for 4 days. So the bombardment stopped religiously at 1:30 every day and then resumed again at 5 o'clock in the evening after they'd had their break and their wine. It was also, and I'm not going to talk too much about the tunnels today. I mentioned about the fact that how easy it is to tunnel in Gibraltar by virtue of the topography, the natural rock. The Great Siege obviously was when the tunnels were first built. They were considerably extended during the Second World War when the threat of invasion. So Hitler was very interested in taking Gibraltar for all the strategic reasons that I've already mentioned. But he needed Franco to support him. He didn't want to risk an amphibious landing. It's quite a difficult place to do an amphibious landing anyway. but he didn't want to risk a maritime assault on Gibraltar because he knew that Gibraltar was very heavily fortified. So he wanted to come overland through Spain, but he couldn't get Franco to come alongside. And Franco, I think, quite sensibly, did not want to get pulled into the Second World War. So I'm going to move on. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to move on to Royal Marines. Never talk about the maritime without talking about the Royal Marines. So there are connections, quite very strong connections in Gibraltar with the Royal Marines. And they go back right back to the original capture of Gibraltar that Len mentioned right at the beginning in 1704, when Gibraltar was taken by the British from the Spanish as part of the War of Spanish Succession. It was a combined force of Dutch and British Marines who captured Gibraltar under the command of Admiral Rooke. And that really set that was the genesis really of the relationship between Gibraltar and the Royal Marines. The capture itself of Gibraltar in 1740 is a bit of a non-event really from a military perspective. The Spanish didn't really put up much of a fight. And when most of the women and children fled to Europa Point, which is the most southerly point of Gibraltar, the Spanish governor surrendered. But the Royal Marines then formed the core of the garrison throughout the subsequent Great Siege that I just talked about, and thus bore the brunt of the fighting really with the Franco-Spanish forces trying to take Gibraltar. And the links have just continued. So in recent years, quite a number of the lieutenant governors in Gibraltar, which is the constitutional link between Gibraltar and the UK, many of them have been retired Royal Marines officers. The last one, General Sir James Dutton, he actually resigned early out of his post in September 2015 at frustration with the British government, not dealing, in his view, as strongly as they should have with the constant incursions into to Gibraltar and territorial waters. And there's been others as well. There is a memorial. You can see that's on the top there, on top of the slide, a memorial to the Royal Marines in Gibraltar. But even though the Royal Marines have fought all over the globe over the last 300 years, and are technically entitled to as many battle honours as pretty well most other service units, it was decided by King George IV in 1827 that they should have the globe to recognise their global capability as part of their badge, and only one battle honour, which is Gibraltar, to represent collectively all their battle honours. And I don't think I can ever see that changing, actually. I think that will always stay as it is. The links between the Royal Marines and Gibraltar continue. There was a donation of a piece of limestone, a piece of the rock, from the people of Gibraltar to the Royal Marines in 2014. That piece of rock is on Woodbury Common, which, if any of you have been to the Commando Training Centre at Lympstone, will know it's just opposite, and is where one of the 4 commando tests actually run on Woodbury Common. So lots of links there. What about Gosport and the Royal Marines? Well, actually, Ian Jeffrey did me a bit of a service there, because when he sent us that thing earlier about his great-grandfather, on that picture there, you can see the buildings and the watchtower of Forton Barracks, which was built again in the 18th century, originally as a hospital, and then over a period of time, as Haslow had already been built or was just in the process of being finished at that time, they didn't need a hospital at Forton as well, so they housed some British Army units there for a while, and then ultimately the Royal Marines, who were based over in Portsmouth, in Old Portsmouth at the time, in Clarence Barracks, they were expanding pretty quickly and needed bigger accommodation. So they were moved into Forton Barracks. They took possession in 1848, and shortly after that, the Royal Marines were retitled as the Royal Marines Light Infantry, which was to distinguish them from the Royal Marines Artillery, who had their own separate barracks. The artillery part of the Royal Marines had their own barracks in the Gun Wharf in Portsmouth. And then in 1922, unfortunately, those 2 arms of the Royal Marines got amalgamated with the defence cuts after the First World War, and the newly created Portsmouth Division of the Royal Marines moved to Eastney Barracks, which I know will be familiar to many of you, which was the Royal Marines barracks for a very long time, although I believe it's closed now. It closed about 4 or 5 years ago. After the Royal Marines moved out, the site at Forton Barracks was HMS Vincent, which was a boys' training establishment, and I believe now is St Vincent's College. The shore establishment capability ceasing at the end of the 1960s. So that's some Royal Marines connections. I'm going to move on to the some submarine stuff. So again, I'm going to assume that you'll all know a fair amount about HMS Dolphin and the submarine capability that was built there, the blockhouse that Talbot Edwards built. That actually started being built in the 14th century. And when the Navy acquired it in 1904, they set about expanding it by adding blocks and accommodations, and it became an independent command in 1912. Originally known as the Haslar Submarine Base, it became HMS Dolphin in just before the First World War. And then during the Second World War, it was heavily bombed. It saw the submarine training school base there was actually moved up to Northumberland, to Blythe, as HMS Elphin. And unfortunately, Dolphin, and again, you will know this, closed as a submarine base in 1998. The Royal Navy Submarine School, so that's the training capability there, that remained at Dolphin until 1999, before being moved over to Torpoint and Raleigh in Cornwall. The submarine link with Gibraltar is interesting because it's only really, obviously the Royal Navy use it as a submarine, and you know the US Navy do as well, use it as a visiting port for deployments in and out of the Mediterranean, and it's a great facility for that. But there was an interesting story that came out about beginning of the year actually, about a quite, something that had been rumoured about, but no one really knew that it was true. But a local Gibraltarian historian managed to uncover the fact that there was a plan to build submarine pens in the rock during the Second World War. And apparently this was pretty detailed plans were drawn up for this in 1942 to build subterranean, and I can only assume this must have been on the eastern side of the rock, to actually build pens into the rock. In a way, if any of you have been to Brest in northern France, you'll see the U-boat pens there that were built, which were incredibly effective and enabled the German Navy to be able to operate out into the Atlantic. So there was a similar scheme being thought about in Gibraltar. 2 reasons for that. One is all the submarines that were going in and out of Gibraltar at the time were having to use a ship, HMS Maidstone, which made them very, very susceptible to air attack. So that was one point. The second was the Italian Navy and Italian frogmen had been really successful in sinking shipping in Gibraltar in the harbour during the Second World War. So the idea was, if you had the subs in pens, it wouldn't be quite so easy for the Italian frogmen to get through the nets and start putting mines on them. So that's at a very high level. That is some stuff about Gosport and Gibraltar, and some similarities and some links and some connections. I want to just finish off, and hopefully I've given you some stuff that you haven't heard before. I wanted to just finish off, and I suspect there probably are some veterans online here who will know what I'm going to talk about now, which is the rock race, the Gibraltar rock race, which is a tradition that still continues. As the Navy gets smaller and smaller, lots of their traditions continue, and this is one. So for those that don't know, Gibraltar is often the first and last stop on any deployment out of Portsmouth and Plymouth, or out of the Clyde. So there is quite an emotional tug for a lot of, I'd say probably Army as well as Navy and Royal Air Force. There's quite an emotional tug to Gibraltar. And the tradition is for the rock race that every ship that calls in, every commander unit that calls in, every Army unit that calls in, the British Commander of Forces team there, unit, will set up a rock run for them. And that involves a 2.5 mile run, 2.7 mile run from the dockside in the naval dockyard on a route up to the summit with a climb of 1,300 feet. And it's pretty steep. you might be wondering what these two slides are. The slide on the right is members of HMS Bulwark, starting out on the dockside in the naval dockyard and you can see there's some great traditions in the Royal Navy. Some of them are in fancy dress. Got a couple of bananas in there. One chap looks as though he's in his pajamas or his dressing gown. So that's the team from Bulwark. And the great thing is that they're all trying to beat a record to get up there. And the record is 17 minutes, 29 seconds, which is held by the gentleman on the left, which is a chap called, he's out of the Navy now, and he's very involved in Scottish athletics. His name is, or his rank was sub-lieutenant. His name is Chris Robertson. He ran it in 17 minutes, 29 seconds in 1986, and it hasn't been beaten since, I'm told, which is an incredible statistic, really. I'm just amazed that no one has managed to beat that yet, given the changes in diet and the emphasis on changes on physical fitness, etc. But anyway, there you go. So the rock race record is still held by that gentleman, Chris Robertson, 1986. He was on deployment with HMS Glasgow. He was a very good runner anyway, and he'd already broken a record on a ship of a mile around a particular deck. I can't remember which ship it is. So there you go. There's another little piece of information for you about Gibraltar. So that's all I'm going to say this evening. I know Len and I are happy to take any questions on anything you've heard this evening, or if you've got anything else you want to ask us about.